Thank you once again, Dr. Sears, for joining us for Mindfulness Off the Cushion. This is episode 3 in our second season of our wonderful podcast, where we try to do our best to bring pragmatic how-tos for our listeners who are doing their best without striving too much, right? To be mindful throughout the day. So today, we're going to touch on a few more myths from your book, Myths of Mindfulness. When was that book published, Dr. Sears?
Just last year, 2021.
All right. So it's definitely very current and certainly very relevant to our listeners. Claudio, why don't you get started with the first myth that from what you've told me, is a very common one.
Absolutely. A lot of students attending workshops and events, even teaching in the workplace, have this common misconception around mindfulness, which is, and you outline this in your book, which is the myth that I don't have time to be mindful. What do you think about that, Dr. Sears?
Yeah, well, all of us have so many things to do. We wake up, we're immediately feeding the kids, getting them to school, and then off to work, and all this stuff going on. So, in fact, I remember somebody asked this exact question of Jon Kabat-Zinn, right? So, one of the popularizers of mindfulness, great mindfulness teacher, has so much to offer. Somebody asked him this very same question. Well, what do you tell people when they're just so busy? There's so much to do, and now they got to do this too. He just said, don't do it. Just don't. You got enough other things going on in your life, so just don't. And I love that. It's not like he's trying to sell this or here's this package and, this is right for you. The basis in reality for that myth is that if you really want to do this well, you need to make some time for it, because we've got to create some new patterns, some new habits. So it's good to carve out some time to practice and do something differently. So that's the basis that, some people just don't want to do that. They literally feel like every moment's already filled and this is just going to be another activity they have to do.
That's great, Dr. Sears. And you use these words. You say, if you want to do this well, you have to carve out the time, right? So my question is, like, you introduced the word formal mindfulness practice in this chapter when discussing this myth. What is, if any, the relationship between a daily, consistent, formal mindfulness practice and what you're encouraging your readers to do, which is to practice informally, to bring the practice into their daily lives?
Yeah. And, this word formal we can use kind of loosely, but it just means you've made a conscious, intentional choice to make time every day to pay more attention, be more in the moment. Right. So whether it's listening to a recording or doing some specific thing like the body scan, where you systematically move your attention through your body, what those things do is exercise your attention. So it's like saying, I want to get in shape, but I never want to do push-ups or sit-ups. Well, you kind of need to do those a lot. And you don't just do them once, right? You don't do one push-up and say, I've got it, I'm done, what's next? It's exercising your muscles, just like we talked about last time. You're exercising your brain pathways by setting aside some time to practice. So there's the truth in that piece of it. Are you willing to set some time aside? Now, it's amazing to me how difficult this can be, because no one ever tells me, what, I never brush my teeth. That's 2 minutes a day. I could be accomplishing something more important. If that's important to you, you just do that for your own self-care. And the reality is, if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be effective at work. You're not going to be effective as a parent, or as effective if you don't make time for yourself, especially over the long run.
So how much time then? Is it like a minute practice, or is it a 10-minute practice? In MBSR, it's 35 to 55 minutes a day.
Yeah.
Is there a sweet spot?
It's a really good question. And the research has been very mixed. Some show the more you practice, the better. Some have actually shown the opposite, that the less you practice, the more mindful you are, which is very interesting to me. And I wonder if that's because sometimes people are doing it to try to get rid of feelings or to feel differently,
Right.
versus doing it to be present and pay attention to what's happening. So there's some debate on how much is enough. I did see a study once that for some reason 12 minutes was a magic number, that if you practice more than 12 minutes a day, you got more benefit. I would say, and based on other things I've read, consistency is more important than quantity as far as total quantity. In other words, it's better to practice 3 minutes a day than to wait once a month and do it all day, because the point is to really bring this into your life. And to circle back around to the I don't have time to be mindful. Well, here's the reality. You're in this moment, whether you're paying attention or not. So it's a funny thing to say, I can't be present in the moment. You're already in the moment. Where else are you going to be? All you're saying is that I'd rather be in my mind. And, even in your mind, you can be present in the moment. So the question is, am I doing this on purpose, or am I just going off automatically? And if I can tell a quick story, I remember when I was with one of my Zen teachers, and somebody asked this question of, I've been practicing so much. I love it here at the retreat. I'm starting to feel better, but I'd slacked off for a long time. I wasn't practicing. But here I'm getting into it again, and now this is great. And, I'm afraid I'm going to stop, doing this when I leave this retreat. How do I not slack off and make sure I practice a lot when I leave this retreat? My teacher leaned forward and said, why are you making practice different from this moment? Right? There's not practice mind and then all the rest of the time. This is the only present moment, whether you're doing it as a practice or I'm talking to you, it's the same moment. So it's not that there's a quantity of time that we're losing. So this is where you can integrate. So the purpose of doing the formal practices is so that you can more easily bring that state of mind, which is just present in the moment, into the other activities you have in the day.
This is a great segue, almost as though it were premeditated. Ha ha, LOL. But the second myth that we wanted to talk about today that you have in your book is mindfulness can only be done with formal daily exercises. You've touched on that. Perhaps we can unpack it a bit further. So, and just for clarity, perhaps you could explain, what do we mean here by a formal practice? And perhaps then you could give us some exercises or ways that we can be more present in the moment. And I'm thinking, Claudio, actually of your definition in your online course, you talk about the act of remembering. And is that a secret ingredient? And I know I'm asking you a couple of questions here, but is that a secret ingredient to actually remember to be in the present moment? Can you talk about the myth and unpack that for us a bit?
Yeah, interestingly, if you look at the Japanese, which came from the Chinese word for mindfulness, it has a sense of remembrance. When you take it apart, it's now mind, literally, but there's also a sense of remembrance in the sense of remembering, bringing it as the opposite of dismembering, where you're in pieces. So you're kind of bringing yourself back together in this moment. So it's a funny thing. Part of this practice is remembering to remember to notice what you're doing right now, because we've developed such habits of always thinking about the future or the past. And sometimes that's useful, but we're doing it so automatically. It's like we've worn a groove in our brains. So remembering to practice and remembering to ask yourself, what am I noticing right now as part of the practice? And so these formal exercises can help with that, right? Because the reality is I could say, oh, you're always in the moment. Okay. And then you go off. You don't know what that means. You don't know what to do with that. So, well, let's give you some structured practices. It reminds me of martial arts, where I am now. I literally don't ever want to do a technique, because that's forcing something to happen in a situation that's always unique in every moment. But for me to tell you, oh, it's easy to win against every single attack, just don't occupy the same space at the same time as the attacker's weapons and just don't be there. It's a very simple concept, but we need to start with some kind of structured exercises to give you those experiences so you can eventually let all that go. And it's the same with mindfulness. So the programs that got started way back, I believe in the 70s, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and based on lots of other programs like that. There are things like the body scan, and that's a good exercise to notice concretely your physical sensations, right? You can only experience something through your senses in the present, right? Otherwise, it's just a memory or something in your mind. So noticing what your feet feel like, noticing all the different sensations in your body. And even if you have pain, to notice the actual sensations separate from your thoughts about them is important. And this trains our attention. So I'm going to put my attention where I want it to be. I'm going to keep it there. I'm going to shift it when I want to. So it's a sort of way of exercising it. So it's a nice way to have something structured that you can practice and develop the skill. And there are other exercises like that.
It sounds like these formal mindfulness practices help us to create a little bit of structure around this capacity to train our attention, to be present.
Yeah, and that's what makes them helpful, because I've talked to people who've tried this on their own and they set a timer and they say, I set my timer and then it goes off and all I've done is think about what I'm going to have for lunch or what happened at the office yesterday. So it's nice to have something to practice keeping your attention on.
But yet you introduce this very awesome concept, which is to drop into this mind-body system and to ask ourselves a very simple question. What am I noticing right now? And that in of itself is a powerful mindfulness activity.
Yeah, I'll give you a secret. My teacher, who recently passed away, he made me a Zen master. And so one of the big secrets, not that he hid it from anybody, but one of our biggest practices is just to keep asking ourselves, what is this?
Yeah.
And then the answer being, don't know, because thinking is not the same as the experience. So the knowing or thinking, hey, I know what this is already a layer between us and reality. So what is this? Don't know, just dropping right into the moment.
I'm just going to take a moment here. On page 135, under further resources, you mentioned the Complete Ninja Collection from Black Belt Communications. And I just think it might be I highlighted it, right? Because I'm like, ooh, I want to know what that is. Well, I love the fact that you brought up martial arts and the art of ninjutsu, Dr. Sears. So on page 135 in your book, Myths of Mindfulness, you mentioned as a further resource when you were talking about the myth of it takes years to become mindful, you mentioned the Complete Ninja Collection from Black Belt Communications. I'm dying to know what is in that resource and how is it relevant?
Yeah, that resource is a collection of my teacher, Stephen K. Hayes' writings that he got started back in the 80s. So just sort of republished it, repackaged it with all the different volumes in one collection. But that is honestly what got me involved in all of this stuff from the very beginning. So when I was a teenager, I got picked on a little bit, as maybe a lot of kids do, and had these fantasies of being this powerful person, and saw Bruce Lee movies and this old show called The Master about some ninja guy that was getting training. And then I started reading these books by Stephen Hayes, and it just seemed unbelievable at first. This was back when nobody had heard of what a ninja was. And my teacher had gone back in the 1970s to Japan and found the last living ninja grandmaster and became his student. So he started writing books about it. And it's fascinating to me because I would read about the martial arts part and then kind of skip over this meditation, self-development stuff. It didn't really matter, only to realize that that's all important. And in fact, even after all these years of training, I've made it to 7th degree black belt. I'm always learning new things. And yet it's always coming back to my own mind. How do I get in my way? How do I end up being rigid? And talk about being present in the moment. You have to be fully present in the middle of a conflict. And of course, the ultimate goal is to notice things way before they happen. It starts with these lessons, like with the punch, right? I remember as a beginner, you're just kind of whatever's coming at you. Over time, you can realize way before any attack comes, oh, their knee moves slightly, their shoulder dropped just a little bit, their breathing changed, the angle of their head. And so it's really a long time that you can just move or be somewhere else or prevent it in the first place, of course. So applying that to life, how do I pay attention to all these things that are happening, coming together? How do I produce a tiny little shift so I'm just not in harm's way, literally or metaphorically? How do I set some momentum by doing just very small things to leverage and just pay attention?
So you're telling me there's not some secret ninja flavor of mindfulness, that you've already told us everything we need to know to become mindful in the present moment?
Well, if I told you that, I'd have to kill you. But no.
Right.
No, of course, it's the same state of mind. There's just the ninja way of getting there, happens to be through martial arts. But, so many people know this. When you're good at anything, whether it's music or dance or therapy or, airplane mechanic, whatever it is, there's so many subtle things that all this stuff ends up coming into play if you just stick with it and keep working with it.
Yeah. Athletes call it like being in the zone, right?
Yeah.
Similar to that.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what I hear is this capacity that we have to refine our attention and to refine the powers of our attention and to be more in tune with like the nuance of a movement, for example. And, in mindfulness practices, a lot of the times we start with the breath. And what we're encouraging our students to do is to be aware, or to be aware of the nuance of what it is to be breathing, what it is to breathe in and know that you're breathing in, and breathe out and know that you're breathing out. So this nuance is very important. I think right now there's been a major transition that's taking place in the last couple of years, which is trying to bring mindfulness into the workplace. And this kind of, talks about this next myth that you write about, which is that mindfulness interferes with your ability to work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I have a little bit of a background in organizational development as well, since I got my MBA and psychology degree. So how do we apply this in a workplace setting? And I've really seen some extremes when it comes to mindfulness in the workplace. I've seen some people that just want nothing to do with it. We don't have time. We got to be really concrete and practical. We don't have time to get into that mind stuff. All the way to the other extreme of, oh, let's do this all the time. This is wonderful. This is changing everything. And certainly somewhere in between, how can mindfulness be useful and practical? Now, there is a basis in reality to mindfulness interfering with productivity at work. And there's some subtle pieces to it. I looked at one particular research study, and it just boldly proclaimed, and I don't think the researchers did this, but how when people write headlines, they just try to grab something to get your attention, right? And it said, mindfulness makes you less productive at work. I'm like, okay, what is this about? So I started looking into the details of what was happening. Well, here's all they did. They had people stop in the middle of the workday and do a body scan and then go back to work. I'm busy, I'm productive, and then I do the body scan. Now I just don't really feel like working. What was happening was they were kind of escaping from work versus a mindfulness exercise where, okay, I'm noticing the interaction I'm having with this customer. I'm noticing my body posture. If I don't change it, I might end up with a sore back later. There are so many more ways to engage with mindfulness. Now, by the way, here's another study that gets into a bigger question. When people started paying attention, they started realizing, is this really something I want to be doing?
Yeah.
For example, with sales, I'm tricking people into buying something they don't need. Now I'm paying attention to what I'm doing. I start to feel guilty about doing that. And in that sense, to the employer, yes, you might reduce your sales if people are going to be more aware and more empathic with other people. But in the long term, right, we know if you just keep pushing people it's just not sustainable. They're going to quit, they're going to burn out, they're going to be much less productive at work. So to find ways to refresh yourself as you're going along, to be in what you're doing versus some kind of escape or just pushing yourself till you fall over.
So bringing awareness to what we're doing at work can actually increase discontentment if, in fact, we don't really like what we're doing at work, right? I'm interested in your take on the relationship between mindfulness and stress reduction. We're often asked, how does mindfulness help with stress in the workplace? What's your take on that?
This is an important question because there's obviously a basis in truth to that. In fact, I've been part of studies where I taught people mindfulness in just a 4-week program, sort of a condensation of the 8-week program into 4 sessions. And, we gathered data, and sure enough, people's stress went down. Some people's blood pressure went down. They were more satisfied with their work, things like that. He says, so of course, for a lot of people, that's what they want. In fact, my own program that's online on my website is called Mindful Stress Reduction. But here's the reality. If you're only doing this to get rid of stress, you're actually setting up a battle with your own stress. In other words, if I'm going to sit here because I can't stand the way I'm feeling, I've got to get rid of this feeling. Why won't it go away? And I'm accepting it. Why doesn't it leave? You're not really being present with it. You're not really, because the stress is you. And so any battle with yourself is only going to increase the battle. So a more accurate way to describe that is if I'm present in the moment, I may notice that I'm fighting things that are not even here. They're only in my mind, or I may have tension in my body and there's nothing here that I need to be tensed against. It's just a physical reaction getting you ready for a fight or something, but there's no one here to fight. And so you notice that and let it go. So as a side effect of mindfulness, very often you relax, your stress goes down, but it's not necessarily the goal. And in fact, for a lot of people, what surprises them is that it looks like their stress goes up at first because they didn't notice how stressed out they were. They were pushing themselves so hard and then they crash later, or they're very tense and don't notice it until they have a pounding headache. But by checking in, I feel worse than I thought I did. I feel worse, but it was already there, whether you noticed it or not. And you're going to deal with it more effectively if you notice it, whatever it is.
Love that. I love that what you said just in the regard of that the goal, it's a little bit short-sighted to frame your practice as stress reduction in the sense that stress reduction is just the byproduct of the practice. If the byproduct of the practice is stress reduction, all that we're encouraged to do is practice being present, practice of breathing meditation, practice the body scan meditation. But the moment that we make a goal out of it, it takes us out of the present. And it becomes a goal-oriented practice. And there's a little bit of a danger in that.
Yeah. Now, the reality is, too, this gets more complicated when we try to talk about it than the actual reality is. But one way I like to think of it is stress is kind of like a water level, right? If your stress is constantly up to your chin, every little wave that comes along in life is going to feel like a crisis. So it's a good idea to do self-care, to do mindfulness and other things in your life to reduce that overall stress. That's a good thing. But we also need something that when the crisis hits, how do we learn to flow with that? So this is going to sound like it's very hard to tell the difference, but there's a big difference between, oh no, I'm stressed, I can't stand this, I'm going to do a mindfulness practice to get rid of it, versus, oh, wow, my heart's pounding, my shoulders are really tight, I'm feeling very stressed right now. I think I'll do a mindfulness practice to come back to this moment and take care of myself. From the outside, it looks like the exact same thing, but the attitude makes all the difference. The first is I'm just going to fight this, which I'm only fighting myself, versus this is what's here, and I'm going to consciously choose to do something to take care of myself.
It sounds like in one you were practicing aversion, in the other one you were practicing acceptance.
Yes, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Claudio, you're so smart.
Shut up.
So is that where the 3-minute breathing space comes in? Dr. Sears, you had mentioned, maybe we shouldn't be taking 45 minutes out of the day to do a body scan, because when we go back to work, we may not necessarily be in the right place to truly be productive. You had mentioned the 3-minute breathing space in your book. I assume this is kind of where it fits, right?
Yeah, this is a good place to fit this in. So those longer exercises are good to do at home as a muscle building activity, so to speak. But a short exercise like the 3-minute breathing space is a way of consciously choosing in the middle of the day to start to put some of this skill into practice. Now, I get a lot of different reactions when I talk about this and when I teach this. And it comes, by the way, from mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And I believe MBSR does it as well. A lot of interesting reactions. Some people say, I really don't like this. I need more time. So I kind of tease them. I say, you need more time to get into now. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? What they usually do is, I need lots of time to change myself. When the point of this exercise is just to drop into the moment as it is. And this one especially, you might not like what you find because you might not have noticed how busy you were or how much your thinking was going on about something. It's a way of just checking in. And again, as short as it is, it's interesting to see people's resistance to this. I was working once, in fact, with a psychologist who came to me for stress because she was just so busy, had so many reports to do, had a long waiting list, and was constantly stressed out. So we did a mindfulness exercise. In fact, we did this 3-minute exercise, and we'll do it together in a moment. And, right there in the session, she said, okay, this is nice. I said, well, why don't you try this during the workday and see what happens. And she was immediately like, no, can't do that. I don't have time, which is pretty darn sad if you don't have 3 minutes in the middle of your workday. I tell people at least do it in the bathroom. If they follow you in the bathroom, you got bigger legal issues to deal with. But when we probed it a little more, her real concern was, I'm busy. I got all this energy. I've got to try to get things done. What if I pause for 3 minutes and then now I don't feel like working, right? She thought her stress actually gave her the energy to work harder. Mm. Now, I'm not going to argue with anybody. All I said was, well, obviously the way you're doing it now is not working or you wouldn't be here. So would you be willing to just try it? What's the worst that could happen? At least try it at the end of the workday. So the worst that could happen is you lose some productivity at the end of the day. So she was willing to try it. And now doing it a couple times doesn't make a huge difference. But what she started finding was by pausing and taking even those couple of minutes to refocus, now her work actually got more efficient, right? Because when she was sitting with this client gathering data, she wasn't thinking of the 20 other clients she had been working with. She could be present and do a more efficient job of getting that. When she was writing a report, she wasn't thinking, I got 20 more reports to write and I can't stand this. I wish I didn't have to write. She could just write this word in this sentence in this paragraph. And so that got done more efficiently. And her overall stress level went down. So she had actually more energy to devote to what she was doing instead of internal battles with herself.
It sounds like an incredibly powerful tool that we could use throughout the day. Our mission, as you know, Dr. Sears, is to bring these pragmatic how-tos to our listeners. So perhaps if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more and perhaps even stepping us through a 3-minute guided meditation, we'll make that content available to our listeners between episodes. All right. Well, let's move on to the next myth. And I cannot wait to hear your response to this one. The myth is that mindfulness requires non-judgmental acceptance of things. And I have to admit, I had to scratch my head a little bit. I might have even done like a head tilt on this one, Richard. When I think about non-judgmental acceptance of things, isn't that like a core tenet of mindfulness? Help us understand.
Yeah, and I chose that headline on purpose to get people scratching their heads. And, maybe the key word in that particular sentence is require. And I just wanted to poke at people a little bit because this word non-judgmental gets very confusing for people. Now, if you practice, of course, you understand what that means. But I think if this is new to you, that just makes no sense. So, I'm in an abusive situation or some horrible things happen to me or some awful medical condition is going on. I'm just supposed to accept it and not have any judgments about it. That doesn't seem right. And in fact, there's been talk about dropping that from the definition just because it creates some confusion. But I think it's nice to have in there to start a dialogue and talk about what this means. Now, of course, the practice is the best way to get what this means, but we're talking now, so we'll do some talking about it. A better way to say it might be to temporarily suspend or set aside the brain's constant tendency to judge or compare this moment to some other time and some other place. So say that again, temporarily suspending or setting aside the brain's tendency to constantly judge or compare this moment to some other time and some other place. In other words, if as we're talking, the listeners are thinking, well, this guy's okay, but I wish we had John Kabat-Zinn as a guest, because he's the man and he knows all about this stuff. Even if that judgment is true, while you're thinking about that, you're not actually listening in the present moment. So judgments are our mind's way of taking us out of the present, right? So you ever been with somebody, we all have at least one relative like this, right? That no matter what's happening, no matter what the situation, they find something about it to judge. So you're in this gorgeous balcony in a hotel room in Hawaii overlooking the ocean, and the person next to you like, we didn't get free water bottles. I can't believe that. Why didn't they give us, just look at the amazing scenery. There's always something that you could be judging. Now, sometimes that's useful, but if you can never turn that off or not get caught up in it, what happens is your reality is always filtered through these judgments and through these words. So that's the truth of it. We do want to practice setting those aside and not be caught up in them. But I think some people take that too far and they think the point is to throw away all the judgments. Can you imagine someone sitting in a room and then the fire alarm goes off? Now, this has actually happened to me, believe it or not, during some mindfulness workshops where in the middle of an exercise, the fire alarm went off, right? The last thing you want to be doing is practicing non-judgment in that moment, right? Oh, I'm noticing a shrill piercing sound, but I'm not going to judge that. Oh, there's a funny smell in the air and my respiration's becoming increasingly difficult. How curious. Oh, how interesting that the temperature of my flesh is increasing exponentially, right? In those cases, you'd want to make a judgment to get up and get out of the room, right? But far more likely is when you're practicing, a judgment comes up like, I wish those people would shut up and stop laughing in the next room. I'm trying to practice being compassionate over here, right? Okay, well, that judgment's probably not so helpful. So you kind of notice that one and just set it aside or go back to what you're doing. So maybe a better way to say it is not to get rid of judgments, to be less caught up in judgments. They're going to come and go. Sometimes they're useful, but just noticing. And I think you both can appreciate this as practitioners yourself. Initially you think it's to always be fully focused, never have any thoughts, but over time, it's hard to put this into words. It's not multitasking per se, but it's like you can be present and have trains of thought, right? So I'm present in this moment talking with you, but I'm also thinking about what I want to say next and thinking about what I already said so I don't repeat myself. But I'm not so caught up in those, I forget what I'm saying right now. So it's like you can have these here and helpful. And, we need judgments. You have to make a judgment as to what side of the road to drive on, whether or not to stop when the light turns red. So it's not that those things are bad. We just want to watch for the ways we automatically do these things and get caught up in them. It's fascinating to me, and common for new people to be practicing. And here they are trying not to judge themselves. So they're feeling their breath. And then they start thinking about lunch. Oh, wait, I'm thinking about lunch. I'm not supposed to be thinking about lunch. I'm supposed to be feeling my breath. And hold on a second. I think I just judged myself. Oh, crap. I just judged my judgment of myself, right? So you just start to notice judgment is here. And I'm going to feel the breath, another judgment. You can just notice and keep your attention where you want it to be.
So we have a little surprise for you, Dr. Sears. We just recently added a widget to our website that would allow our listeners to ask us questions. And we have a question this week from a lady by the name of Amy. And I'm actually going to play the recording of the question for you. And it is on the topic of judgment. So let's play that for you now.
Nice. Yeah, thank you, Amy. That's a wonderful question. And that comes up a lot. And this is one of the problems with the mind is when you try not to do something, it does it. So if I ask you right now, don't think of a pink elephant or something bad's going to happen, you have to remember to not think of a pink elephant. So the whole time you're thinking, I'm not going to judge thoughts, you're judging your judgment of thoughts. And then you're judging your judgment of thoughts as, I was just talking about. So one thing you can practice is just to notice, oh, judgment is here. Oh, judgment about my judgment is here. Just notice that. And as I was just saying, the goal is not to get rid of those. It's to be aware of them. What's very interesting is we often don't even know we're doing it. So we meet somebody and we form all these judgments, and then we start treating them a certain way. Now, maybe they're based in reality, based on the way they're acting. Maybe it's some past stuff creeping in because this person reminds me of somebody that hurt me in the past. So now I treat them a certain way, and then self-fulfilling prophecy, they become distant. And so the first thing is to pay attention. So as you say, what happens when you're trying not to form judgments is you're just going to get caught up in them all the more. So think of it as I'm noticing this is happening and how interesting. Now, over time, your attachment to the judgments will start to soften and they'll just kind of come and go in your mind. But the first step is just to be aware. So ironically, trying to get rid of them is one of the things that keeps them there longer.
What I'm hearing is just through the act of noting or labeling or acknowledging that the judgment is present, that in of itself will begin to change the relationship to the judgment itself?
Yeah. Now, as you know from your long practice, you get there. But a key that I know you possess is curiosity. So this sounds so funny, though, but most people say, yeah, I'm noticing a lot of stupid judgments here and how stupid I am for having stupid. Okay, so it's not just noticing. It's noticing, wow, I've got a lot of emotions with that judgment. Wow, how curious that this is so difficult. And how am I noticing, where am I noticing the sensation of difficult? Am I tense? Anger is present, noticing all these connections. There's a whole nother topic we could get into, but thoughts themselves become conditioned with emotions and meanings, whereas in reality, they're just sounds. They don't have any, an external reality, but our mind conditions these thoughts with certain emotions. So I think what you're getting at, Claudio, is that you start to recognize this conditioning, and over time that weakens and becomes less overwhelming.
Noticing coupled with curiosity.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a funny thing to say to somebody who's suffering, right? But you know what I mean, where you get to that point of, instead of, oh no, I can't stand it, why is it this way, is okay, this is the way that it is. So let me explore it. Exploration is a more open way of, and more compassionate way of working with yourself.
So this next myth is the myth that you can only be mindful in a peaceful setting. You have to I don't know. I always start off my workshop with, there's this myth that you have to escape to some mountains with a bag of sprouts and sit there and chant Om for hours at a time. But you're pointing to something different here, Doctor. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the basis in reality for that is, of course, especially when you're beginning with this, it's so much easier to do it in a peaceful setting. I had the good fortune of traveling to Bodh Gaya in India and up into the mountains in Nepal with some of my teachers. And, when you're sitting there looking at the Himalayas and hearing monks chanting, and you don't have to go to work that day, and all the food's provided for you. Boy, is it easy to be in the moment. So, there's something to that. And in fact, the other important thing to that is our minds tend to become what we're exposed to. So if you're in chaos constantly, it's hard for your mind not to become that. It's interesting to me, even now, when I watch a movie, full of violence, I'll have dreams that night. My brain's just kind of regurgitating what it was exposed to that day. So there's some importance for having a quiet, peaceful place. And on a smaller scale, it's nice to do in your home. I try to set aside some space or out in the yard by my pond, where you can reconnect. Nature tends to be a really good place to do that, because the shape of a leaf or the shape of a cloud tends not to pull for a lot of analytical thinking. The reality, though, is that very few of us will choose to live a monk lifestyle where we just go off and that's all we ever do and live in a monastery or whatever. So what does that mean? I can only be mindful, once a day at home in my special place. So again, this comes back to, we're exercising our ability to be present, but we want to bring it into our work and into our relationships and into our life. And you're going to manage the chaos all the better, right? If you're paying attention while you're stuck in traffic, you're going to decide whether or not I should change lanes or just sit here and wait, or watch when somebody's trying to pull in all of a sudden. That's going to be important to pay attention versus just closing your eyes and wishing it all away and trying to go to a calm place in your mind. You're going to actually do better if you can be present. I once did a mindfulness workshop for an emergency room staff. Even in the middle of an emergency room, you want to be mindful, right? I mean, can you imagine if you rush in to the ER and, your bones sticking out and blood spurting or whatever, and the doctor looks at you and says, oh my gosh, that's freaking me out. I got to close my eyes and go off to my happy place and I'll be with you later. No, you want them to be fully present, even if it's stressful or intense. So that ability to deal with that is very important.
As like you said, not all of us have the luxury to go up to the Himalayas, right? Or to go to a special retreat somewhere. It's about bringing this practice home to wherever you are. And I understand that you do not prescribe mindfulness to all your clients, but those who are open to this practice, how do you recommend that your clients start a mindfulness practice? What would be like step one for them? What would you recommend for them?
It all depends on where they're coming from. Like you said, I don't try to shove this down anybody's throat. I mean, on the one hand, being more present is going to be important no matter what you're trying to do in life, but whether it's a formal practice or just making time for yourself, in whatever way, a hobby or whatever. So, I may recommend, the other day I was working with a guy that was in charge of his own company, constantly busy. And I said, well, what do you do for fun? And he just kind of stared at me like, fun, what's that? I don't have time for fun. I'm like, well, what did you used to like to do for fun? Or what was your time to just be present? And he said, fishing. Like, well, my prescription for you is to see if you can set up a fishing, date this weekend or whatever. And so for him to just be on the lake with the fishing pole, that's a fantastic, mindfulness practice, to be present. And yet now he's got to come back to work. Work doesn't go away. In fact, there is some fascinating research that shows that, vacation often makes people worse, because you go off on vacation and assuming you are not thinking about work, you actually take the vacation, you start feeling normal again, which is important. But then you got to come back to work, and all that work you weren't caught up on is now piled up with more work, and you feel even more stressed out, right? So you need the vacation. It's nice to take the retreats. And can I come back from work and just, what's most important thing? And now I'm just doing this thing. So engaging that way. But back to your question, an ideal way is to take one of these 8-week groups, and I believe they're offered there at the Austin Mindfulness Center. I've got an online version on my website. There's probably lots of them out there. The nice thing about these 8-week structured groups is I like to think of them as a boot camp for learning mindfulness. So instead of just an abstract concept, I have lessons each time. I've got homework to practice in between, so I can start building the mindfulness muscles, so to speak. So the one side would be a formal program like that. The other side is just find some hobby. And then there's all the ones in between where I might say, do this 3-minute exercise once a day, or experiment with different exercises and find the one you connect with. So one of the nice things about the 8-week group and all the formal practices is we do lots of different things. So somebody might say, oh, that body scan, I can't stand it, but I like the listening one, or I like the breathing one, or I like the walking one. So we're also having different ways, here we are present in the moment, but we're just kind of looking at it from different approaches, and you might find one that you connect with. Although with a twinkle in my eye, I'll tell people the exercise you hate the most might just be the one that has the most to teach you. But, if you don't do it, then you're going to quit, and that doesn't do anybody any good. So find the one that you connect with to start with.
All right. And for our final myth that we're going to cover, I'm actually going to cheat a little. I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball and combine two of them. One of them is only great saints can do mindfulness. And it's just not for me kind of mentality, right? And combining that with it takes years to become mindful. And so if I were to sort of paraphrase this myth, typically when we think of someone who is ultimately mindful, someone like a monk or a Jedi or a ninja, perhaps, do we really have to be someone who has practiced it for so long and perhaps achieved some sort of sainthood quality or status in our lives?
Oh, great questions. And, here's the thing. We're all born with mindfulness, right? This isn't some weird abstract thing that, we've never heard of, never discovered. When you're a little kid, you can just get lost and absorbed. I mean, lost in a good way, where you're fully present in what you're doing. You're not worrying about school tomorrow. You're not wondering whether or not you're going to make it to retirement, and you're not regretting all the tantrums you had earlier the day, whatever. You're just right there in the moment. As we grow up, though, we're kind of programmed into paying more attention to the future and the past. And there's a use to that, but we fall out of balance and get too much in our heads. So when you're completely lost in your head, Life has so many difficult things. When you do get present, you notice anxiety or depression or awful things you don't want to experience. It may feel like it's going to take a superhuman effort, to be more present. And also this illusion that somehow, you're just going to make everything stop. And, like you've got some kind of magical powers there. So it doesn't have to be that way, and you don't have to make your goal to always feel a certain way or be 100% aware of everything. First of all, you can't. There's so much happening. Even right now in this moment, no human being can take it all in, certainly not consciously. So, you don't have to. And some people set up this, it's such a big goal, I'm not even going to get started. The question can be, what's one small way I can be more present in my own life? And so likewise, we could say it takes years in the sense of if you really want to make it more consistent, and you can always keep learning for the rest of your life for that matter of subtle pieces to this. But the reality is, do you hear my voice right now? Do you feel the clothing on your skin? Did you notice that you're breathing? You're mindful. That's all. But the mind doesn't like that. It wants to say, well, there's something else. There's some mystery. There's something I'm missing. It's got to be more complicated than that. Okay, notice your mind is wondering if there's something more complicated than that. And we're sitting here having a conversation.
What is that? I'm interested in your take on this with all of your academic experience. What is that natural tendency of our minds to overcomplicate things or just run away with some story or narrative about our lives that may in fact be entirely untrue?
Well, no one knows for sure, but it's very interesting to explore evolutionary psychology. To me, it's fascinating, and yet we can never go back in time and know for sure with some of this stuff. But it makes logical sense that if you can anticipate the future, if you can remember the past and learn from it, you're more likely to go on surviving. And in fact, there is a negativity bias. It's been found out the brain does tend toward the negative. And they believe that's because, if you're overly negative, it's okay. If you're too optimistic, it could kill you. So in other words, I'm walking down a path and I look ahead and I can't tell if it's a snake or a stick. If I think, well, that's a snake, I'm just going to walk around it, no harm done. But if I like to think positive, that's not a snake, that's just a stick. And then I get bitten and I die and I don't pass on my genes. So there's this tendency, what could go wrong? I've got food, I've got water, so let me look at what else could go wrong, versus an appreciation of what you have. So that ability to predict can be very, very helpful. But as we talked about, what you do, neurons that fire together, wire together. The more I think a certain way, the more my brain wants to do that. So as we developed more and more intellectual stuff, more and more words, we got more and more exercising that part of our brain. Whereas in the past, we all lived outside. I think it was that comedian Jim Gaffigan talking about people who love camping and like, yeah, my family's loved camping for generations. Well, everybody was out in the wilderness for too long. And when you're living out in the wilderness, you're naturally in your senses. And so to also have that thinking and predicting, very helpful. Unfortunately, we get to a point now where, especially with technology, it's all in our minds and we're losing touch. So it's not bad to predict and learn from the past, but it comes at the exclusion of being present as well.
This seems to be a constant theme throughout your whole book. On one side of things, we have this mind of ours churning out compulsive thoughts about the future or the past. We even have the neurobiology to support and reinforce this type of thinking. And yet, in your words, we also have this natural and innate ability to be more fully present. So my question is, how do we reconcile these seemingly different and even opposing tendencies in our human experience, in the human condition?
I think I'll take a whole different look at that by asking, who are you? Now, I don't expect an answer, but what happens is we start to think we are our thoughts. And so if you think you are your thoughts, then you get really caught up in your thoughts and you fight your thoughts, and then your thoughts are opposing to something else versus sort of stepping back, so to speak. And yes, thoughts are here, emotions are here, my body sensations are here, my roles in life, but who I am is so much more than any of those things. And so it's not that there's a fight and I've got to fix this fight. I sort of step above and see that that's just a part of a bigger picture, that's just what brains do as they think and they judge. My heart beats. I'm not going to be like, stop beating or don't beat so fast and it's just, sometimes it'll be beating faster. Oh, that's interesting. It's just doing its thing. And now I could get caught up in that and all worried about it, but I can realize that's just what my body's doing for whatever reason right now. It doesn't define me. And so that's the tough part, is to recognize thoughts are something my mind does. It's not who I am. And so, it's like people that fight their thoughts, good thoughts, bad thoughts, good thoughts, and I kind of whisper in their ear, hey, both of those hands are yours. You don't have to fight yourself. You can just step back. Oh, look, there's a battle going on with my thoughts. Look at that. There's constant thinking about the future. Thanks for your help. And in this moment, this is what I'm going to do. I may choose to think about the future. Maybe it's important, but I don't have to compulsively go into that. It's just a function of my brain. It's not who I am, which is a funny thing to say, but you can experience that the more you practice, as you know.
So we have just a couple more minutes with you today, Dr. Sears, and I want to wrap up with something a little bit less expected. As you know, and as we've said multiple times, our mission is to bring these pragmatic how-tos to our listeners, helping them remember to be more mindful throughout their day. And yet in your book, you mentioned, you talked briefly about the importance of sleep. So can we take just a couple of minutes and unpack that for us? Why is sleep so important?
Well, as human beings, sleep has a huge impact on our brain, and it's definitely impacting on attention. So as we've been talking about, mindfulness has a lot to do with attention. In fact, there was a fascinating study. This was done a long time ago, where they took a big group of kids that were diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, randomized them into two groups. And for one group, the only thing they did as an intervention was to make sure they were getting enough good quality sleep. So no drugs, no therapy, just sleep was the only thing they did. And half of those kids no longer met the criteria for ADHD after just getting enough sleep, right?
Amazing.
Now, there may have been a lot of other factors going on there, but we all know if you don't get enough sleep, it's hard to pay attention. So it's going to be hard to be present if you're sleepy and sleep deprived. And as a nation, I think we just get so caught up in activities and things to do and worrying in our minds that we just don't quite get enough sleep. So, for what it's worth, you can say this is important to my health. It's got to take a priority, and get more sleep. And interestingly, you'll actually get more done because you'll be more present and more productive if you get sufficient sleep.
And it almost goes without saying, but we have to make that right choice. We have to make that wise choice the night before. At least, and I know, sleep is likely a huge topic, and we're not going to have time to unpack it today, but just setting the environment for us to have enough sleep. And then when inevitably we'll wake up in the middle of the night, trying not to force ourselves to go to sleep. Do you have any quick tips or tricks that we can have as a takeaway for today's episode?
Yeah, I just saw a meta-analysis. There's all this stuff that's supposed to help with insomnia, to help you when you can't sleep, right? Now, there are some common sense things like don't have caffeine late in the day and all of that sort of stuff. But fascinatingly, the meta-analysis says if you can't sleep, do nothing. Because everything you're trying to do to get to sleep is interfering with something that can only happen by itself. So at the very least, you can just lay there and think, oh, I'm just resting my body. I'm going to sleep or I'm not going to sleep. And in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that you might be sleeping more than you think you are, but you keep looking at the clock and thinking you're not sleeping, but maybe your brain really is drifting off in between those times you look at the clock.
All right. Thank you once again, Dr. Sears, for your time today. And we'll see you very soon.
My pleasure. Get lots of sleep and be in the moment.